Everybody see that? So I'm Laban. I represent the Open Compute Project Foundation. I also am involved in Open UK. Open UK is an organisation, again it's only 2 years old, which is very, very similar to what Clare's doing in Ireland. What they're trying to do is bring together open source technologies, hardware, software, and open data to create synergies on IT infrastructures. Now, lots of people are not aware of the scale of open source, but on surveys you'll find that most enterprises, 98% of them have got open source software somewhere in their infrastructure. Now, how many people know what open source means? Anybody? You know? Yeah? So, if I said, would it be one of the ingredients would be taking away vendor lock-in to benefit the user? Yeah? Everybody understand that? So, traditionally, when a vendor sells you something, they're basically locking you in by tying the hardware and the software together in a proprietary fashion. And what open source does, it unbundles the hardware and the software to give you the freedom to do what you want to do on the infrastructure. And it covers the data center facility itself, all the mechanical and electrical stuff, the servers, the network, and over here we've got a lady who's going to put her hand up and you'll get to know her, all about open networking. Now, they're a real big success story, EPS. They are doing open source networking, and when they started, they just started like a rocket taking off. Very few people know about them. They're based literally a few miles away from here. So talk about the successes. There's lots of successes happening in open source technologies in Ireland. In fact, the majority of all the computers in all the data centres in Ireland are open source computers. But very few people seem to know about it. So there's a huge success story. What we're trying to do is create a story, let people know, and we need more people in the supply chain. We need people in the supply chain because the demand is great. Let's give you some numbers. On open source hardware, the ICT hardware, the servers that go in data centres, a report came out last week. The Open Compute Project conference was on last week, and the latest research is $49 billion of sales on open compute servers last year. Now, there's other things happening in the open technology market. There's also the recirculation of hardware. Because when you've got open source technology, you can recirculate it, you can re-hack it, you can reuse it. And there's a company that probably few of you have heard of called IT Renew. And this year they will sell 1 million recirculated open source servers. Now, if I was going to put this in position in global terms, if you counted all the computers, the servers coming off manufacturing this year, globally, around about probably about 35 to 40% follow the open compute specification on hardware. So when you look at the hyperscalers, they're all open compute, they all use open source software. Where we've got the issue is governments don't do it, hyperscalers have done it for 10 years, enterprises don't do it. And it has a profound impact on the environmental footprint on the way you build a data center. Now I'm going to focus on the environmental impact on this because last week I was at COP26 and we were talking about the importance of open source technologies for sustainable data centers. And last week we issued a blueprint for a totally decarbonised data center dependent on open source technologies. So I'm just going to go through a few things here about the carbon impact because of what happened last week. And what I would like you to all go away with is learning at least one thing, and there's something quite profound about Ireland being a leader in the science of climate that goes back 162 years, which most of you probably don't even know. So let's just give you a few pointers. So, you might think, well, this is a crazy question. Why is the sky blue? Anybody know? Who found out why the sky is blue? It was an Irishman. 160 years ago. That's why we know the sky is blue. How do we know that CO2 in the atmosphere acts as a greenhouse gas? We know because of an Irishman 162 years ago. An Irish guy. Who's going to tell me his name? Anybody? Anybody know the name? You keep quiet because you know the name because you've cheated. Okay. Any guesses?
I read it this morning, I still can't remember.
Right, okay.
Tyndall, is it?
Tyndall. So, John Tyndall. Okay? And I'll just show you a bit more because this is going to focus on how it links. So this is your man. So you should be really proud. He was a renowned scientist back in the 19th century. He actually became the head of the Royal Institution of Science in the UK. He was world renowned. Now, what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about carbon emissions. I'm going to talk about carbon emissions associated with data centres. And I'm going to make this link to open source. And you cannot move towards a decarbonised circular economy unless you use open source technologies. And this is the point I'm trying to get across. COP26, you all know about that, the big climate conference that was at last week, yeah? If you want to see this blueprint that we submitted, you can just go to the Open UK sustainability page and you can download all this information. You can see video recordings of what we did last week and you can learn from that. But even though the regulations haven't hit you yet fully on your role towards a decarbonised economy, they will this year and next year. There is an acute sensitivity at the moment in Ireland, and specifically around the Dublin area, where you might see politicians and policymakers clamping down like they've done in Singapore, like they've done in Amsterdam, where they put moratoriums and prevent you from building any more large-scale data centres. The way you address that threat is you must decarbonise your solutions that you propose. It's really key to, if you're going to alleviate that risk, you must follow a decarbonised agenda, okay? Just flick in, but it's not working. Question, is there a climate emergency? Who believes there is? The impact, that's good. Because if you don't believe this, then you might as well walk out the room because you don't think you've got a problem to solve. If this room was full of young people, I would get 2 hands from each person. It's a really different thing to do with age. I'm very into all this because my wife is a sustainability policy person for the City of London. So I get this every morning at breakfast. I know this intimately. So here's a question. My screen's flicking here, it's not working. Can anybody answer that? That's a pint of Irish stout, call it Guinness if you wish. What does that glass of Irish stout have in common with the data centre carbon footprint? Where are the emissions from the data centre? Where do they come from? Any ideas? Suggestions? Come on, it's an intimate room. Throw some things over. Electricity use, perhaps? Yeah? Who thinks that the electricity use at the data centre is the biggest form of carbon emissions from the data centre? Anybody? Why is the industry, the data centre industry, totally focused on PUE and energy efficiency? Because all that addresses is the carbon emissions associated with the consumption of electricity at the data centre. Well, that element is a tiny percentage of the overall emissions of a data centre. So what I'm trying to show here is if that's the total whole life cycle carbon footprint of the data centre, what the current data centre industry, outside of the hyperscalers, because they work differently, but in the enterprise space, and most of the people here, looking at all the carbon emissions, that little bit of froth on the top are the emissions that most people in the enterprise space are concentrating on. The bulk of the emissions are in the black stuff at the bottom. Who knows what that black stuff in the bottom is called in terms of carbon emissions? Anybody? Scope 3. Now, Scope 3 is all about the embodied carbon in the data centre and all the hardware and the supply chain emissions. That's where the problem is. Now, the problem in Ireland is there's no regulations to force you to look at Scope 3 yet, but there will be. New legislation came out in London in March this year, so when you put a planning application in, you have to actually, in your planning application, put an assessment of all of your Scope 3 emissions, all that embodied carbon in the upstream to the facility and the downstream waste stream as well. And if you don't meet compliance, you won't be able to build buildings anymore in London. That came out in March. This is going to roll across the world. So, just making you aware, the legislation hasn't hit, but if you can jump in front of legislation, when it hits you here within the next 2 years, you will have an advantage, a competitive advantage, an environmental advantage in business over your competitors that will start to fade away and go out of business. So this is a kind of an advice for your business. Now, I'm not going to go into all this, but this is how it all goes together. It's called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It was developed in 2001, so it's 20 years old this year, and it tells you all about it. Now, what you guys are concentrating on in the industry, you're concentrating on Scope 2, the electricity consumed at site. Now, why that's becoming trivial is because we're decarbonising very, very rapidly the grid. So we're going to go towards almost like a zero emissions electricity grid, and it's happening really fast. By the time you get into the next decade, you'll be there. That's how fast it's happening. Once you get there, then all of your emissions, 98% of all your emissions become the Scope 3, it's the embodied and the supply chain. And that's going to hit you next decade. 98% of all your emissions are going to be supply chain related. Here's the question, how do you address the supply chain emissions? And this is where open source comes in. Because with open source, it allows the circular economy, and the way you address the supply chain problems, the embodied carbon, you have to maintain equipment at high utilisation for as long as possible. You have to keep rehacking it, you have to keep reusing it. And the problem with proprietary solutions, you can't do that. With open source, you can. So that company I mentioned at the beginning, IT Renew, they're selling 1 million servers this year, and their servers that come out of the Facebook data centres here and across Europe, get repurposed, rehacked, and reused. So that's where the opportunity is. It's a huge, huge opportunity. Today, ignoring the second user market, the circular economy market, it's a $49 billion business, and it's growing at a rate of 39% per annum. Whereas the traditional enterprise data centers are closing at 10% per annum. So for me, and I've been in business for many years, get on the curves that are going upwards, not the curves that are going downwards. That's the recommendation. So there's huge commercial business benefits if you track what's happening on the environmental side. You're going to get access to these slides. I'm not going to kind of go into it, but I just recommend you read some of these. Now what this is called Drawdown, and it's addressing the number one culprits to do with greenhouse gas emissions. And the number one culprit is to do with mechanical chilling systems and the gases within them. There is absolutely no need today to use mechanical chilling in a data center. None at all. This is just talking about something called the global warming potential. So for example, carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1. But some of the gases, the F gases that you see here, 1 kilogram of this SF6 will have a 26,000 times more global warming impact than 1 kilogram of CO2. So these gases are going to come under attack from the environmentalists, the politicians and the policy makers. And if you've got a business based on this, then it's going to be wiped out in the next decade, because they will not be allowed to be used. The policy makers just haven't caught up yet, but they are catching up. I won't go into detail, I'll just try and make you aware. Look at the stuff afterwards. To learn a little bit about the embodied carbon. This is a really good book. It's 6 years old. It's a really good book, and it talks about the embodied carbon in everything that you generally use. And the reason it's called How About Bananas is because if you're eating food, the lowest carbon footprint food that you can eat is bananas, believe it or not. And you'll hear all this drive towards decarbonising the agricultural economy, like removal of beef or lessening the amount of beef, and these other kind of ruminant type creatures, beef, sheep, etc., because of their carbon emissions. And it's interesting how it's not really a carbon emission, it's a methane emission problem. And back on that other table, you saw that methane, its global warming potential is like 20 times worse than CO2. So when these cows burp, this is the issue. Now, all this is very, very new, and this research is very, very new, and it's only happened in the last 5 years that we've been able to measure the greenhouse gas emissions from cows. And when they're seeing this is why at COP you got that agreement on methane reduction. Do you remember the COP? Big focused on methane. Everybody agreed on methane, because methane is a real big hitter when it comes to global warming. Okay? So it's a good book to read. But in this book, you'll see what the embodied carbon is, scope 3, for a computer. And just to give you an idea, a server that goes into a data center, the embodied carbon is scope 3, supply chain emissions, upstream and downstream, is about 2 tonnes of CO2 for single computing. 2 tonnes. For a circuit board that goes inside the computer, for a 1 kilogram weight of circuit boards, you multiply that weight by 152 and you get the carbon emissions. Okay? So it's huge. This is why we're driving very, very rapidly towards circularity to reduce this emission problem. Who's learned one new thing so far? Anyone? One new thing? That's great. That's I feel like the chief. Mechanical and electrical stuff, there's loads of embodied carbon in it. Now, again, this is really big in London because of this legislation that came out, and we have to measure it. This is a fantastic book produced by CIBSE in London, Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers. engineers, and it's how you calculate the embodied carbon. So when the regulations hit you, and you have to submit embodied carbon figures for your mechanical and electrical designs, you need to read this book and apply the methodology in order to calculate for your submission to planning permission. Okay? Now it will change later. You won't need to work it out. You'll get these documents that will be coming in, these internationally standard agreed documents, where every single bit of kit will have a document associated with it to do with emissions and also all sorts of other environmental issues. And you use that, and you add them all up, and that's part of your submission. That's how it works. Now, there's one company that really in front of everybody else, and it's Schneider. Schneider have a range of products called their green premium products, and in there you can download this environmental specification, and from that you can find it. But all the other manufacturers, none of them are doing it. I don't know any other manufacturer that is looking at embodied carbon. This is why Schneider won the award of the greenest company in the world this year, because of what they're doing. They're way in front. Why are they way in front? It's because they're a French company. Because France is nuclear. It uses very low carbon electricity. So they've always had, for decades, the problem, not the emissions due to electricity, but the emissions due to the embodied carbon. So they're kind of 20 years in front of everybody else because they've always had the embodied carbon as an issue because they decarbonise what we call the scope 2, the emissions from electricity. All new, only came out in January 21. Now, there's a lot of stuff in here which I'm not going to go through on how you kind of walk through doing whole life cycle emissions. And all I'm saying is, I'm just trying to stimulate an interest. It's something I believe you need to do before the politicians and the policy makers come in and take your business away from you if you don't move. Yeah? Because remember, we've had moratoriums in Amsterdam, they've shut down Singapore, Frankfurt, you can see it everywhere. So if you want to get around it, you've really got to start looking. And it will be much broader than just the concept of data center. When I talked about taking the Facebook data centers from IT Renew, the second user ones, and repurposing them, what's happening in Netherlands now, because of all these policy drives that are occurring, they're taking air-cooled computers, converting them into liquid, and then implementing them to warm up greenhouses. So there's a company called Block Heating, one of the biggest, in fact the biggest European cloud service provider is OVH. They've got over 500,000 servers. They do the same thing. They don't use air cooled, they take second user computers from hyperscalers, turn them into liquid, and that's how they do their systems. And that liquid, you get the water coming off the servers at about 68 degrees and it's very, very usable. They're perfectly silent data centers, there's no fans. And now they're distributing the data centers into buildings. And there's a company that's won all the innovation awards last year, it's a German company called Cloud and Heat. Go and have a look at what they're doing, copy them, set up a business, and you'll be very successful because their business is flying forward. See? All this is in that book. And you can go and read it afterwards. These are the product declaration forms. This is where Schneider have got the edge, because they've done it already. This is just trying to show you that the change that's occurring. So if I looked here on this big one here, I've got the body carbon, operating carbon. Look at the big one, you'll see that, a few years ago, most of your issues were operating emissions, the electricity. Look what's happening over time. You decarbonise electricity, all of your problem is the green embodied. So if I showed you the environmental footprints of, say, Microsoft, 95% or 96% of all their emissions are embodied because they decarbonise their electricity. Same for Google, 96%. Same for Facebook. Directly you decarbonise electricity, you've got a big problem on embodied carbon. And that's why all these companies use this technology, this open source technology, because they know they can repurpose it and reuse it. That's how they address it. I'm just going to click through to my pint. Hopefully I can get it to drop the next asset. That's it. So, just to take away from this is when you look at the total carbon footprint of the data center, you're messing about with a scope 1 and 2 at the top, which is diminishing really, really rapidly. So when you start doing all the PUE stuff, all you're doing is that tiny percentage at the top. Where your problem is here. But the reason you haven't looked at it is because the regulators here haven't screwed you to the floor on it yet. But they will. So I'll leave it at that. And I hope you've learned something that you can take away and commercialise, because the opportunities are huge. So thanks for your time.